Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Smith. I am a mom and a business owner and also a fellow podcaster. So, a mommypreneur, if you will. I am the mother to one 2 year old. We just call him Pork Chop on all public things. So, mom to Pork Chop. And I am a meditation teacher. So, I do a lot of prenatal and postnatal guided meditations on a podcast called Meditation Mama.
Do your meditations continue past that postpartum period?
Yes. So I have two different podcasts actually. I have a bigger one called Mindful in Minutes, which is is more general for anyone. And then Meditation Mama, I mostly focus on fertility. So we have some like soul baby work, a lot of prenatal meditations, then some postpartum, but they don't usually extend beyond like mom and toddler. And then once our kids are getting older, then we graduate to Mindful in Minutes.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you for that distinction.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you have this amazing meditation practice. So you're a professional in that way. Were you doing your mindfulness practice and did you have your business before you became a parent?
I did. So I've had my business for about 10 years.
Okay.
And then when I was pregnant, Pork Chop was a pandemic pregnancy. So I was at home a lot. I was very sick without a lot to do. And I thought, you know what? Like, I already share guided meditations. Why not start a second podcast? And that's where Meditation Mama was born. And I was just sharing the practices that I was using throughout my pregnancy, knowing that if I needed them, especially during that time and those particular circumstances for a pregnancy, I was like, if I need them, there's definitely other people out there that need them. So that one was my pregnancy baby before the baby.
I'm interested to hear you reflect on your experiences. It's been a couple of years. And I know now you're, as a professional, you start to broaden your lens to what do other people need? What have other people's experiences been? Because you know that your experience is not what everyone's experience was. So I'm interested to know if that has impacted you as you have thought about how you reach a broader audience.
It's funny because I do think a lot about motherhood, of course, and how my experience is different from everyone has a completely different experience, especially not just in general, like existing on earth, but particularly the motherhood journey is so unique to each individual person that identifies as a mother. But I think that there are a lot of like similarities too. And for me, looking at the similarities, I like to look at the common struggles in a way and how a lot of times the things that we struggle with as mothers, they stay kind of pushed down and hidden in the back. I think about it as like that old piece of cheese we have sitting in the back of our refrigerator where it's just like thriving and molding, like being forgotten about and shoved down deep. And so I do think about how our experiences are different, but I also think about how, like, for example, when I started sharing prenatal anxiety meditations, like we don't talk enough about how we're getting better at talking about postpartum anxiety or even postpartum depression, but we don't talk about how those things can happen while you're actually pregnant. We often are made to feel that pregnancy is all sunshines and rainbows and we'll just be grateful that you're pregnant and all of that, which is true. And also, there can be some really challenging pieces physically, mentally, and emotionally. So I also like to think about how a lot of our common struggles through pregnancy are the ones that we don't really talk enough about, and how there's a lot of through lines in between women that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And to think about what does someone need to get through that so that it's not just a discussion point. Yes, we have prenatal anxiety and what can help.
Yeah, and I think just having someone saying that this is a real thing, that you're
Mhm.
not alone if you're experiencing this, you aren't a bad person if you're not a bad
Right.
mom, if you experience that you're not grateful for your pregnancy, if you are also struggling with mental health at the same time.
There is room for the
Mhm.
struggle and there is room for the gratefulness. There's room for
Yep.
both. Yeah. Okay, so let me take you back then because you're bringing up the idea of prenatal anxiety. And I'm going to take you back to even before you were pregnant and ask about what your exposure to baby feeding and breastfeeding was, even as a child, growing up as a teenager, as you got into your 20s. Did you encounter breastfeeding out in the world and in your life? Were you able to see it up close and personal ever before you were thinking about it yourself?
I did. I worked as a nanny for quite a while as I was building my business. I would work as a nanny during the day and then build my business at night. And my personal favorite age range was like newborn to one. That was my sweet spot. So when I was starting in my 20s, I saw just a lot of boobies, a lot of breastfeeding. But it's so interesting because I had that conditioning of the first time I saw a mom just start breastfeeding in her living room. We were just chatting, she's breastfeeding. I was like, oh my gosh, she's just like taking her boobs out right in front of me. And I realized that we have such a conditioning of, oh my gosh, there's boobs there. And it's
Mm.
so, to me, it was like a little bit jarring. And I had to check myself like in that moment of she's feeding her baby. But I was also like 20 years old and just was in a very different headspace. But I was definitely exposed to it. And like I knew that my mom had breastfed both my sister and I. But it wasn't until then when I started working with that particular population that I really got up close and personal with breastfeeding and different breastfeeding journeys because
Mm.
each mom did something a little bit different. And knowing that there isn't like a one size fits all to taking care of your baby and feeding them.
And so, as a nanny, seeing these different families make different choices, did you then walk away from those experiences with mostly positive associations with breastfeeding or mostly associations of struggle and difficulty, would you say?
I think to be honest, I think I didn't really think about it that much. So
Mm.
maybe neutral. I think that
Mhm.
I was just felt like they're all just doing, I walked away just feeling just everyone does it differently. And it wasn't just breastfeeding, it was also like being in people's homes, like everyone parents differently, everyone sleeps, does babies sleep differently? And I think the big takeaway was one, it really doesn't matter that it's mom's choice or family's choice. But the thing that I really took away was that every mom that I was with felt this insurmountable pressure, whether it be around breastfeeding or something else, that there was like some piece that they wanted to keep secret. Oh, I supplement with formula, but we don't tell anyone that. Or, oh, we co sleep, but we don't tell anyone that. And it was
Oh,
almost like they were
interesting.
telling me these secrets, and I would never share anyone's personal parenting anything, but each mother that I worked with had a thing where she felt shameful around it because society or their parents or their friends or Facebook groups or whatever told them that's like bad. And that was the
Mm.
sad part to me because I was like, I don't care. Like, it's working as long as it's safe and it's working for you guys, like amazing. But it's funny because then once I became a parent, I felt like I had all of this experience with newborns and with under ones because I'd been doing it for a decade. And with the exception of breastfeeding, I had no clue because I had never done it. Bottle feeding, no
Mhm.
problem, because as the
Mm.
nanny, I was almost always bottle feeding something. Introducing solids, no problem. But like breastfeeding, couldn't tell you a thing about it because that wasn't part of my role. I'd seen it, I'd heard about it, I heard about the struggles, but I was like, I wouldn't know how to do it.
So, you had this exposure and you recognized that each family did things a little bit differently. So then you become pregnant yourself during the pandemic.
Found out March of 2020. I literally got those 2 little lines, and then 5 days later, we were in lockdown. That is a whole 'nother story of what having not only a pandemic pregnancy, but a March 20 I mean, I didn't
Yeah.
even get my first OB appointment until my 2nd trimester because it just things were deemed non-essential, and my husband was a medical resident at the time, and even
Oh my
he was
god.
like, "Okay, this is like, this is not what should be happening on." That's a whole 'nother podcast, but yeah, finding out you're pregnant March of 2020, like, that was a roller coaster.
Yeah, that is wild. I can't even imagine. What part of the country are you in?
Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yeah. So, we
Oh,
were solidly locked down. It was still, like, cold out in our little our pre-child life apartment.
yeah. Wow. Okay, so you find out you're pregnant, and then what kind of preparation did you do knowing that a lot of the prep that was available before the pandemic, like classes that were offered at the hospital, maybe those weren't offered. I don't know if they switched to virtual by the time that because I think a lot of people figured it out along the way, but in those early days, hospitals were not figuring that kind of stuff out. They were just trying to stay afloat. So talk to us about the prep you did for baby feeding in particular.
I didn't really think about baby feeding that much, mostly because one breastfeeding class. It was a virtual one because there's like a parenting center here that's really great, and they did, at least by the time I was feeling ready for classes. I can't speak to anyone else's pregnancies, but for me, it's like first trimester, you get through it, you get your feet underneath you, like, and then second trimester, you're like, okay, you start to think, okay, this is happening. And then by the time I was early third trimester, then I was like, okay, now we're going to take the breastfeeding classes. We'll take all of the kind of the birthing classes, things like that. And so I didn't really think about it. And as part of this kind of like package classes that I was taking, there's a breastfeeding class. And a friend of mine had said that she found that to be really useful. I just had remembered her saying she was really grateful she took a breastfeeding class because she didn't know anything about breastfeeding, as many women do. And she was like, I found that to be so useful because I really had no idea. And it blew my mind. I was like, okay. So I made sure to take one of those, and I did. But my attitude going into it, I was like, I don't know, my birthing center, they have a lactation consultant. I'll figure it out as we go along. And maybe that's just like the laid back meditation teacher in me. But I just was like, I made sure I had all the things I went in being like, I'd like to breastfeed, but if that doesn't happen, like I also made sure I had a pump on hand. I also made sure like I had some formula. I'd seen so many parents do it different ways out of both choice and necessity and both, that I was like, I'll just prepare for kind of all the avenues and we'll see what happens. And for whatever reason, I just wasn't too worried about it until I had given birth. And then they're like, okay, mom, let's go. We're going to establish breastfeeding. And then I was like, okay, we're doing it. And that was it.
Who led the class that you took, the virtual class?
I think it was a lactation consult. I can't quite
Okay.
remember, but I'm pretty sure it was lactation
Okay. And did
consultant.
you say you did find it to be helpful or not? I hear both.
I found it to be knowledgeable, but I just, for whatever reason, I felt this. I know this isn't a birth podcast, but I think this tells you a lot about how I went into all this. My birth plan for me personally was say yes to drugs and no one dies. That was just for me personally. I was
Mhm.
like, I don't want anyone to die, and I would like an epidural. And I felt like those were the two things that I wanted, and that it was really his birth plan. And I was like, those are my two preferences. I would like to come in sharing one body and to leave two healthy bodies. Whatever happens between point A and point B is going to happen. And I
Uh-huh.
felt a lot of freedom in that, of not having, I know not every woman feels that way, and that's totally fine.
Mhm.
But for me personally, and so breastfeeding, I was like, the baby will be here and my boobs will be here and we're just going to see what happens.
Great. Okay.
Which, I mean, it bit me in the butt a little bit, spoiler alert, but that was my attitude going into it. I was like, "Ah,
Yeah.
we'll figure it out."
Every person is entitled to going into it the way that they feel they need to.
Yeah,
And then you make adjustments around along the way. I feel like as we become parents, we just make the next right step.
yeah, and I just felt like there was just a lot, becoming a mother and all of the changes, and also, like, not just in that, but then, like, owning a business, and there's so many factors in our lives collectively at that moment that I was trying my best to just focus on kind of what was in front of me and what needed to be dealt with in that moment.
Mhm.
And so to me, that was beneficial, and it really helped me to cope and feel not go into fight or flight or keep me grounded. And so that was always it's just like one step at a time. And so it's like when we get to, I'll take the breastfeeding class, I'll educate myself, try to learn the basics, prepare for all avenues. And then when we get there,
Great. Yeah. And I think let's see, if you were pregnant in March of 2020, you were giving birth by December?
November,
November.
November.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in November of 2020, that sounds like a very reasonable plan when so much is out of your realm of control and you don't know what hospital policies are going to be, if you're going to have your partner in the room or not, if you're going to have access to other support people or not, to just
Yeah.
go in saying, I just want to come out with a healthy baby and be healthy myself. That seems like a very reasonable expectation for November of 2020.
Yes, it worked for us. We followed that. I should have specified I wanted the epidural to still be working by the
Right.
time it was push time, but the 2 things I wanted, I did get them.
Okay.
So, technically, we
Yeah.
met the birth plan.
You met your birth plan, right.
We
Yeah.
hit it, yeah.
Okay. Was there anything about your birth that you think impacted those early feeding experiences?
I've honestly never thought about that. My gut says no, because in my birth, again, I know this isn't a birth story, but it didn't go the way that I joke and say, "Oh, no one," that that we hit the 2 things I wanted, which we did, but it definitely wasn't like a plan A birth. And I think by the time pork chop was out and we had to use the vacuum and all of that, there's a lot of moving pieces, so then he had to be checked by NICU, like, and he was under a lot of stress. It was a much more stressful experience than I would have wanted. So I think by the time, like, he was there and it was time to establish breastfeeding, there'd been so much fear leading up to that moment of him having signs of being under stress and what does that mean? And then all of that. He didn't have any head trauma, but there's always a risk of that. And so I think by the time he was there and it was time to establish breastfeeding, I just felt so relieved that he was there and he was alive and he was healthy, that it felt like okay, that's behind me. He's here, finally out of me, and we're going to do this new thing. And I think I just felt so much relief to have that birth behind me, at least in that moment. And I don't know what your births were like, but I just, if for me, I was like, okay, that definitely wasn't plan A, B, or maybe even C, but we got through it. And I was like, he's here. He's okay. I'm okay. We're moving on to the present, was how it felt like for me. And I vividly remember just being like almost like shocked because, after all that had happened, we had to delay skin to skin for a little bit because there was just some medical things that were going on there. And I don't remember a whole lot of my birth, but I remember at the time when they're like, okay, let's get up and we're going to move you upstairs. I was like, okay. And they were just talking me through, what they're going to do once you go to the recovery space. And one of them, they're like, we'll have the lactation consultant come in. We'll try to establish breastfeeding. You might. And as we were talking about that, and I was just having this conversation of, oh my gosh, like, I guess we need to do that right away. I felt for the first time that my milk came in and it just started like spreading across the little gown. And it was like because we were talking about it, and I finally was thinking, oh, I guess that is the next thing, right? My body responded right away and just started leaking. And I remember like looking down and then looking at the nurse and being like, what the heck is going like, what is this about?
Wow. Really cool
Really,
story.
I vividly remember that. And I just remember being like, okay, I guess my body's ready. Let's go.
Yeah. That's amazing. You
Yeah.
don't often hear this is like before you've moved to the recovery room, you started
Yeah.
leaking. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
like, we
don't
were on they're like, "All right, gather up your stuff, let's go," and we were on our
Mhm.
way up there, and then I just started leaking, and I remember because I didn't struggle with that through pregnancy at all or have any leaking whatsoever, and so that was my
Mhm.
first time, and I just remember it was this mixture of, "What is my body doing?" And then also, "Huh, what do you know? There's milk there."
Yeah.
Okay.
I want it, I get it.
Yeah, I was like, "Oh, I just have to think about it? Okay, cool, let's
Yeah.
rock and roll, I guess."
I think all of your meditation work over the years maybe paid off.
Yeah, that
You man
mind-body connection, yeah.
you manifested that milk in that moment.
Yeah, it was wild. That was really wild where I was just like, "Whoa, it really," not that it's, like, easy, but I was like, it really like, that connection really is.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I haven't heard a story like that before. That's neat.
Oh, I had no idea that was unique. I was like, "I don't know."
Yeah. People definitely leak, and it's not uncommon to have colostrum coming out, but to have somebody say, "Okay, we're gonna go up and establish breastfeeding," and then, like, to think that thought and then
Yeah,
is
it
pretty
was
cool.
wild. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
wild.
I'm so glad you told that story. That's really great. So then tell me how things went from there.
In terms of breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't again, I feel like the through line of this is we got through it, but it certainly wasn't plan A. So we went upstairs to the recovery room and there's a couple of things that I had to do, a couple of kind of medical intervention stuff because of the birth that I had to do. And then it was time to establish breastfeeding. And to me, like labor and delivery and recovery nurses are like angels on earth, in my personal opinion. At least the ones I had, they were like walking angels on earth. And so I had these just angels that were in there trying to help me. And I remember them being so nonchalant about it, not in a bad way, but they were just like, okay. And I just had some of this medical intervention stuff. And then they're just like, okay, let's establish breastfeeding. Here we go. And then they're just handing me the baby and they're like, this is how you do it. And I was like, okay. And they had a lactation consultant I was in a birthing center. So they had one there and they're like, she's going to come in and check in with you and work with you. But he seems he's ready. We wrapped up the stuff with my body and they're just like, all right, here we go. Let's do it. And it was like casual, but I really liked that. Like in hindsight, where I was just like, okay, we're just gonna try it. And so we tried to establish breastfeeding and it went okay. We're still figuring it out, whatever. So the issue that ended up arising, and he latched, and it was very much in my opinion, but you can tell me if this is common or not. We're both just figuring it out. And so our first shot was just very much like we'll give it a try. And it seemed like he latched, maybe not the strongest latch, but he did. So the issue that ended up popping up was there was a concern about his kidneys. So he didn't urinate in his first 24 hours. So there was a dehydration concern. And so they had me start pumping in the hospital, and because they wanted to start supplementing because he was still figuring out his latch and they wanted to increase his fluids. Now, in hindsight, especially after exclusively pumping for a year and a half, like I giggle at this. When they first set me up, whatever, I have my hospital grade pump. They teach me how to do it. And then the nurse is like, okay, just give me a call if you need anything. I'll see you in 20 minutes or whatever. And I called her in almost this like panic. And I was like, because I didn't know what to expect. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's stuff coming out. And I was so, like, confused, and I was pumping, and it was like it was just colostrum, but it was coming out, and I was like, "Wait, but it's, like, coming out," because she had said it hadn't been that long since I'd given birth, and she's maybe you'll get some colostrum, maybe not. But it was, like, coming out, and there's stuff dropping down into those little tubes, and I
Uh-huh.
remember calling her in, like, a panic. I was like, "What do I do? There's actually stuff coming out." She's like, The containers are gonna catch it." And I don't know what I thought was going to happen. I think back and I, like, laugh. Of course, that's the point. At the beginning, it's only a few hours. It's maybe when you pump, maybe stuff comes out, maybe it doesn't, and it was, and then I just called her in this panic, and my husband didn't know what to do. Really, we were both kinda confused. He's like, "Well, call the nurse." And I was like, "There's stuff coming down, and it's, like, dropping down into these little things." She was
That
like, "That's great." And she just goes, "Yeah, you're pumping. There's colostrum coming out. That's great. Congratulations." I was like, "What?"
Yay!
And I was shocked. Like, what? I don't like, you know how after birth, like, everything leaks? That's just how I interpret. Nothing is safe. Everything is leaking. There's stuff coming out of everywhere. And so then I was like, "Wait a minute. There's stuff coming out of my boobs too?" And I just called her in a panic. And she was like, "No, congratulations. You're doing it."
I
And
I
so then
love
there
this
was
story too.
I was like, I'm telling you, sometimes ignorance is bliss because I was just like, okay. And then she just hyped me up. She's keep going. I'll see you in 20 minutes. I was like, okay. And then we'd actually collected a good amount of colostrum, which is great. So then we had to use like those little syringes, you know?
Mhm.
And so we had a lactation consultant. We were consulting. There was this concern with his kidneys. How do we get his fluids up? And we talked about the different options. And I loved my care team because they're very like, here's the options. Let's talk about pros and cons for all of them. What feels like the right choice for you? And so I decided that what felt like the right choice was to supplement with what I was pumping, get the fluids up. So no problem. So we started doing that. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this, with the work that you do. We had to do the thing where you take like the syringe, and you put your finger in there to try to like simulate a latch. And then we were putting some of the colostrum directly into his mouth to increase his fluids. So, what ended up being a little bit tricky though was I this up to a man thing because they're always like really lazy about their food and they just want what they can get when they can get it like quickly. And in hindsight, I think what happened was because we were supplementing and his kidneys ended up being fine. He just for whatever reason just didn't pee for 2 days, and then at the second day, he had this giant, like, geyser of pee into his face. I was just like,
Right.
"Okay, buddy, whatever," and his first really big cry because he just peed in his own face and whatever, and we're just happy he'd peed because we were so worried at that point. It'd been, like, 2 days, and we had to monitor even more closely than you usually would without a concern like that, fluid intake and wet diapers, all of that, so we continued to supplement, and I think what happened is that he just got really comfortable not latching and getting his food that way, that every time when we went home, and we had some success in the hospital with some latching, and I don't know if it's because I don't have a very fast letdown or what, what it is, but he was so frustrated, always so frustrated. And because there's this concern about his fluids, we're like, we'll keep working on the breastfeeding, but we have to keep the fluids up. And we continue to do that at home. And he just never really latched. And the thing that became really hard was I became very hard on myself. In those first few days, you are just along for the ride. And emotions are up and down already, not sleeping. I mean, everyone listening to this, I'm sure, knows exactly what I'm describing. And every time we would try to establish breastfeeding, and we did everything. We had a lactation consultant. We were meeting all the time, trying everything that we could to try to establish breastfeeding. And he didn't want it. And he never really latched. It became so frustrating and emotional for the two of us. And I was crying, he was crying. I felt very much like, oh, why can't we get this? And you were doing it just like a day ago, and now you're not. And it became such a pain point for me. And thankfully, I had a friend, because we all need our good, like, mom's group chat, and I have really great friends, very supportive. And I was just telling them what was going on. And all of my friends had a different breastfeeding journey. And they kind of reaffirmed that if this is causing so much stress and torment and upset for both of you. And one of my friends, she was like, why is this so important to you? Not in any kind of a minimizing way or anything, but she's just reflect, like, why is this latch so important? Like, pumping, like exclusively pumping, basically at that point, he was thriving at this time. And she was like, just give it thought. Why is it so important? If you decide it's really that important to you, then keep going, push through it. But if you're doing this because you feel like it's something you, quote, should be doing, just give that thought, because you're so upset about it. He gets really upset about it. You really start to, I was not like avoiding, but I was just like, every time it was time to try breastfeeding, it was just so stressful, so much pain, so much anxiety. And one of the lactation consultant that I was seeing, and I was talking to her, and I just was so upset and just feel like I can't do this. And she was really supportive. And she was the first one that told me, I was like, I'm not breastfeeding. She was like, stop right there. She's, you are breastfeeding. She's like, breastfeeding doesn't always mean like nipple feeding. You are breastfeeding. She's like, even if you are breastfeeding into a pump and then your baby is taking it through a bottle. And there's something about hearing that really let go of some of that pressure. And then having a friend of mine remind me, just ask yourself, like, why are you going through this? And that really made me stop and reflect. And I think I had a lot of judgment of myself. And I think I was worried, and there was some external judgment too. I think sometimes it's older generations, they just can't like help themselves sometimes. And things are just different. 32 years ago when I was a baby, people you didn't really exclusively pump. It's not like you could just get a Willow or an Elvie and slap it in your bra and pump on your way to work. It wasn't really a thing. And so I think that I mistook a lot of people's confusion or misunderstanding for judgment, which was very triggering for me because I had already passed a lot of judgment on myself.
Mm,
And it just felt like it wasn't what I imagined the first few weeks of motherhood would be like. And after I reflected on that, I was like, you know what? Like, everyone's right. Like, why do I care? And I realized I only cared because it was like, I felt like this is what you just should be able to do. And I like couldn't do it. And I wanted to be able to do it. And I had to do my own kind of healing around that, my own reflection on that. And exclusively pumping was working for both of us. And that's okay.
yeah. I love that you had those people in your life that weren't pressuring you to go either way, but that were asking the right questions to help you make the decision for yourself.
And it was great because they all, in the mom group chat, they all had very different like breastfeeding stories. They were there to ground me and remind me. And I feel really strongly about this now, that it's like, you just need to tune into your own kind of true self, your own intuition. And it's what is right for me and my baby. And that there
Right.
isn't a wrong answer to that question. If you're tuning into that, what you get, there's never a wrong answer to that. Or it's, you know what, the right answer. Because I know for a lot of women, exclusively pumping for a year and a half, which is what I ended up doing, that sounds like a nightmare. And that's perfectly fine. If you're like, you know what, I'm done exclusively pumping, I want to switch to formula, that's amazing. That's great. If you are someone where you're like, I want to exclusively breastfeed for 3 years, that's amazing. That's great. There isn't a wrong answer to asking your truest self and, like, your inner mother, like, what is the right move for us?
Yeah. Yeah, and breastfeeding really is a relationship between 2 people, so you really wanted it to be working from the body to your baby, but your baby was telling you, "This isn't working for us."
It's so tricky in those moments. I felt I was used to, like, control and, like,
Mhm.
control of my body, and if I want my body to do this thing, then I just do this stuff, and then it eventually can do this thing, and I'd never really been had a relationship like that where it was, like, with pregnancy through breastfeeding where you're sharing, like, 2 bodies are being kept alive from 1 body, and how that's a completely different relationship than just navigating the one person with the one body.
You're right, there is no right answer, but the important thing is that we tune into ourselves and to our babies and say, "What do we need to make this work for us?" How many weeks in were you when you finally
I think it'd been about a week or
Okay,
so, or I think maybe we've been, like, home for a week.
okay.
So a week and change, and for me, I was already at that point, like, exclusively pumping, and then we were just trying to establish a latch, and I was like, "I'm already doing this." All types of feeding is a lot of work, but, like, when I actually looked at, like, what entailed exclusively pumping, I was like, it was a ton of work. It was the right decision for us, but it's like you get up and then you feed the baby the bottle and you do that whole situation, get your baby back down, and then you're like, okay, now it's time for me to go pump. And then you go and then you do the pump and then you clean the pumps. There's just so many like extra steps. And I was like, I'm already doing this whole song and dance exclusively pumping. Then why am I also putting myself through this torment of trying to force this thing that obviously isn't working at the same time when we're both happy, or at least like pretty okay with exclusively pumping. And the thing that ended up being really nice about it is that then my husband, because he had an actual paternity leave, which is great, 6 weeks, and like they really got to bond during that time. And he didn't just associate like me with like his food source. Like it ended up being in that respect like a really nice thing where really anyone could feed him and could take that time to bond, whether it be a grandparent or an aunt or my husband or me or a caregiver, whatever. And it ended up being a nice thing in terms of bonding for both parents and also responsibility sharing, especially in the overnight portion of us being able to take turns in a way. And so that ended up being nice. And Pork Chop was like he was thriving in terms of like weight gain and like all of that. And like I had a good supply and all things considered in hindsight, like it not to minimize and say like it really wasn't that bad, but like with everything that like could potentially arise, it was pretty it was just like it was just from the start where it was like, okay, I just this is what we're doing. But my supply was always good. I was able to exclusively pump for a year and a half, and then I decided to wean myself. Otherwise, I think my body probably would have been fine to just keep going. And that was a process, of course, of weaning and deciding, like, when am I done with this? That's the other side of the spectrum where you're like, "Oh, am I?" And now and then you get this guilt. You're like, "Well, am I a bad mom for cutting him up?" Because now he like loved his bottles. It was like, oh my gosh, his bottles with his mama milk was like Jesus on earth. Like whatever he just that was just like his thing. And then I was like, "Well, am I a bad mom for now deciding that like I'm done?" And I just realized that in my heart and my body, like I just I was done. And like my body, when you look at pictures of myself at that time towards the end of my breast, like I look very like haggard, not in a way to be like hard on myself, but like you can tell that this physical toll again of having one body sustain 2 lives for so long had taken such a physical toll on me that, and I started to recognize that in myself. And I was like, okay, like my body could keep doing this, but should it? I don't know about that.
That's such a good point. And the recommendations are always to breastfeed for as long as both mom
Mhm.
and baby are happy breastfeeding. And it has to be both. I think often we make so many sacrifices as moms. And sometimes we think that we have to make sacrifices at every juncture. We do sacrifice to pump and to breastfeed, and that's okay. It's okay to do that. And it's also okay to say, you know what? I'm done with this sacrifice. I can move on to other sacrifices. This can be one that I can let go of at this point in time.
Yes, 100%. And at that point, we had some freezer stash, and honestly, I was just ready to have my body back for me. I had been sharing it for so long, and maybe I would have felt differently if we were breastfeeding. I have a friend now who is our children are pretty close in age, and she's still breastfeeding and it still works for them, but her baby latches and it's like a connection thing. And so I think for me, part I was like, okay, I'm done with hooked up to the exchange just for whatever. And maybe it would have felt different if we still had that like connection piece. But for me, it just felt very much like I'm ready to have my body back and to not live and die by this pumping schedule. And oh, it's in this many hours. I need to make sure that I come home and then I'm pumping and this and all these other things. I was like, I'm ready for a little bit more freedom and autonomy over myself again.
That makes a lot of sense. By the time that pork chop was at 1.5, had you dropped some pumping sessions already?
Yes. I think I was down to three, like a first of the day, a lunch hour, and a nighttime or like a before bed was my, and it was just getting really hard too. He was mobile and my husband works in healthcare, I solo mom a lot. And to me, there was nothing more like infuriating where you're all hooked up to this stuff. And then your 1.5-year-old is like, oh, this would be a great time to try to like bust into the staircase. Or, this would be a great time to go try to kill myself. And then you have all these tubes, and you're like, and you're like ripping these tubes off and trying to like chase down a toddler. And it ended up being just such a hassle. And then it's time.
Yeah. So at what point, because people who exclusively pump, every person is different. So no person can say, follow this exact schedule or do this exact thing. But you never struggled with supply, right? From the very beginning, you always
No.
had a great supply. So
Yes.
at what point did you like drop the night feeds, or how did you figure out when you could play with your schedule a little bit so that it could be a little more flexible for you?
I That's a good question. I tried to start dropping some night feeds about as soon as possible. I was like, those ones are gonna the 3 a.m. That one's gonna pretty high on the list to get rid of. I honestly, I don't know if this is a weird answer. The internet helped me a lot. Like where at first I would follow like different schedules. There's a lot of really great resources if you are like exclusively pumping and how different schedules that you can do. And I followed a lot of those that would help me decide based on his age, how could I kind of change and adapt in a way but not lose my supply. But I think I was pumping about 8 times a day for the first maybe 3 months or so. And then I tried to drop some of the night ones. And I just started going, I would do like hours windows and say, okay, then I'll drop down and I'll do every 4 hours as opposed to every 3 hours. And then I'd say,
Okay.
okay, now I'll do every 5 hours. And then over time, I would just, because I struggle isn't the right word, but I found like my breasts during that time, they were a pain. They were big, they were heavy. Sometimes they'd hurt. I felt like I was just lugging these things around. So for me, just extending a little bit and naturally then a session would drop is what just worked for my body because it's like when those boobs need to be emptied, it is not fun,
Yeah, for sure.
not
Yeah,
comfy.
whether you are exclusively pumping or you supplement feeding from the body with pumping, if you are wondering how you can wean from the pump, I will have an episode linked in the show notes. It's episode 82. It's all about weaning from the pump. If you would like one on one support for this or any other lactation challenge or question you are encountering, whether virtually or in person, which will most likely be covered by insurance, reach out to me at www.quabbinbirthservices.com, also linked in the show notes. I can't wait to meet with you. And did you ever feel any tenderness or soreness after you stopped?
I would say the first week after I stopped was like a little bumpy and your body's adjusting. It's changing a lot. You feel these big, heavy, I call them cement cantaloupes, was what I called them. That's what it felt like. But I think it was, if I'm recalling, it was just that first week when I was like, when I'd stopped and then my body figured it out after that first week or so. And then they deflate and then they get real cute then.
Okay. Yeah.
After a year and a half
Right.
of exclusively pumping and then
Right.
everything
Yeah.
deflates and you're like, "Oh, these are
That's what they
not
look
my
like.
these are not my 29-year-old boobs that I
Right.
started with."
It's funny. I breastfed for a total of 8 years between my 2 kids, and, my husband just the other day, he was like, "Hey, your boobs look like they did before," and I was like, "I don't even remember."
Yeah, that is a yeah, distant memory.
Yeah, just a memory. I couldn't even tell you. So I wanted to ask, speaking of my husband, about your partner
Mhm.
and you talk about this very emotional journey. It was a week's time, but that week can feel like a century when you are in the throes of the postpartum hormones. Can you tell me the ways in which first of all, was your partner supportive during this decision making mode? And if so, how was he supportive both practically and emotionally during this
Mm.
decision making time? And then beyond as you continued to pump? You named a couple of things, but I'd
Yeah.
like to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I'm really fortunate. He was so supportive and he has this. So he was in residency. So he now starting this year, he's a doctor. And I know sometimes doctors get like bad raps, but he was so supportive from the get-go, from pregnancy all the way through. Even thankfully he got to be there for the delivery. But I think part of it too was that we've been together for a long time. We know each other really well. He also understands like what I need, and I don't need to be told what to do. That will never go well. Not that he would ever do that, but like I versus other people I know, they like to have more guidance or more input when making these decisions. He has always felt very strongly, and this is one of the many things that I love about him, but very much like my body, my choice. Now, if we're making a decision that if it's like a parenting decision or something that we have to do together, but he very much recognized, and I really appreciated that he actually had like the medical perspective where he could just reassure me in a way of like looking things up and being like, medically, there's nothing wrong with doing this, which would comfort me a little bit to have that reassurance. But then emotionally, he was like, you know what? Like I can't breastfeed. Like I can't like you are the one that you're going to have to you can are the only one that can walk this path in essence. And he was very supportive. I think it really hurt him to see me hurting so much in those first few weeks. And he was supportive. And when I wanted to try, he'd be like, okay, I'll go get the boppy and whatever. And he'd help and do all of that. But he also really recognized that this was fully my body and my choice. And when it came time to ending, and I had a lot of guilt around, so we just talked about being done and him not letting, he's really good at naming it with him being like, okay, let's look at the facts. The facts say that he's been thriving for the last year and a half. The facts also say that your body, according to the data, isn't very happy right now, probably because of these that he's good at laying out the data and being like, here's the thing, and then just being like, but ultimately it's your choice because you're the one that's doing that. And for me, that's what I've always needed is don't tell me what to do, especially if it's like my body or something that literally only has to do with me. He did his best to try to share the responsibilities, but again, it's not like I can put the pump on him and we can share the pumping. But he was just really supportive. He always has been in those regards, especially with body stuff. And that if it's my body, it's up to me. And then we try our best to, if it's some either a shared responsibility or a shared endeavor, parenting, or when it was time to introduce solids, what method do we want? We make those decisions together. But if it's something that just impacts me, the ball's in my court and he's there to support it or there to look up the data for me. And then otherwise he's hands off, which is what I like. I know not
Great.
everyone needs. I have friends where they want to ask a bunch of opinions and I'm like, I don't really want to hear your opinion. I like to go into my little meditative state and be like, get all woo woo, be like, call forward my true self and my inner mother and just be like, what's the answer here? And then whatever I come up with, then I do that.
Uh-huh.
And that's what I like. Even we weren't allowed any extra support people for birth or anything like that. And going forward with any other pregnancies that I have, I personally liked that. I would continue to do that because for me, the fewer opinions, the better. And he respects that and honors that and supports that.
Yeah, that's so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so as we wrap up here, any last thoughts about your pumping journey or
I don't think so. I
close out?
appreciate you creating a space where women can share these stories because like I said at the beginning, I think often the stuff that we don't talk about thrives and festers in the darkness and in the silence. And I think that the more that we share these stories, the good, the bad, the ugly, the neutral, everything in between, that it helps to normalize it and to recognize that it's like your journey is exclusively your journey, and that it's all okay what you choose or how you adapt to what's given to you, that you get to walk your own path, and that's okay.
Love that. Okay. So people are listening to this and they're saying, I need some more of that attitude in my life. You've
Ignorance
been
is
on this
bliss, that
path.
attitude.
You've been on this path for years, but if people want to connect with you, if they want to find your work, where do they do that?
So you can always connect with me on Instagram. I'm a millennial, so I'm hanging out there mostly. My handle is at YogaFew And then anyone listening to this, if you want to give meditation a try or already like meditation, I'd recommend listening to Meditation Mama. I actually have some meditations on there you can do while you're breastfeeding or pumping. So I try to do some different things, and studies have shown that actually meditating while you're pumping or breastfeeding can actually like boost your supply. So it's called Meditation Mama wherever you're listening to us. All are welcome. Come as you are. Love to have you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your exclusive pumping journey today.
Thank you for letting me share it.
No matter how your milk making journey went, no matter how it aligned with your expectations, I hope you can now look back and feel proud that you did the best you could, knowing that you made the best decisions possible, and knowing that breastfeeding is not just up to one person, but rather is dependent upon both the person making the milk and the baby. And there are so many factors that go into whether or not a dyad end up breastfeeding. In my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook, we discuss the factors that make it more or less difficult to meet a person's baby feeding goals. It is a community of parents, perinatal support professionals, lactation pros, and people interested in making change so that there are fewer barriers to feeding babies human milk. If this sounds like a space you are interested in, please click on the link in the show notes to join. And if you know somebody who is currently exclusively pumping, share this episode with them. Thanks. Bye. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
I was wondering if when you get older and you have a friend who's trying to feed their baby from their body, if they were feeling guilty about how it turned out. Let's say they were pumping and feeding their baby their pumped milk from a bottle, or let's say they ended up not feeding any breast milk or human milk to their baby because for whatever reason they couldn't do that and they were feeding formula instead, and they were feeling really, really guilty about that or really sad about that. I was wondering what you would say to that friend.
I would say it's okay. You could just push. You could just make the milk go into a bottle from your body. Then you can feed your baby.
Yeah. And what if they, for some reason, weren't able to get milk out of their body and they were feeding formula to their baby instead? And they were feeling sad.
That will be good.
Yeah. Do you think their baby still loves them?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. What do you think the most important thing for a baby is?
Being happy.
Yeah. And they love their parents no matter what, right?
Yeah.
When their parents love them and snuggle them and take care of them.
I think that it's good that that the mom and baby are together.
Yeah. Just when they're together, right? I think you're going to be a good friend to your friends who are having babies. I think you'll be a really good support to them.
I do too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.